As we told you earlier this year, a USDA study released in October showed U.S. growers were adopting precision ag technologies. Half of all corn farms used yield monitors in 2010, about a third utilized auto steer systems, and more than a fifth used variable rate technology. All produce positive but small returns. At Nebraska Extension's recent crop management conference in Kearney, we talked with Purdue Extension corn specialist Bob Nielsen about his research using precision tools and began by asking which practices were useful for farmers.
I think in a sort of a broad category, I think one of the best tools we have out there are some of the spatial data sets like yield monitor data and aerial imagery, maybe drone imagery. Simply because those kind of data sets do a very good job of illustrating the variable patterns in the field for yield or for plant growth. And using precision ag wisely is all about using it to not only describe the variability in the field, but using it then to maybe target figuring out what's the cause of this variability. And so again, spatial data sets like yield, like aerial imagery and the like, they simply give us a much better ability to define these spatial patterns in the field. And then once they're defined, make us a little more efficient with our crop scouting time to go out and figure out what's going on in these areas. And then hopefully, if we can diagnose the causes of these spatial patterns, then hopefully we've got the agronomic decisions we can make to begin correcting those. Because it's all about, well, and I may differ on people on this, but to a large degree I think it's all about managing the spatial variability to try and even things out at the same time that you're trying to ratchet the yield itself ever upward. But if you think about the impact these spatial areas have on the bottom line, and you're putting the same inputs on a field, and yet some areas yield 20, 30, 40 bushel less, your contribution margins are really through the floor in those areas where they're maybe just fine in others. So it's really about managing the spatial variability.
You had talked today about using soil sampling. Tell me about soil sampling randomly versus soil sampling in targeted areas. From
a spatial perspective, and I should probably make sure that when I say, I'm not saying special, I'm saying spatial, S-P-A-T-I-A-L. In terms of spatial variability, soil sampling, when we're, let's say we're doing a 2.5 acre grid soil pattern, which is somewhat common, at least back in Indiana. If you think about it, we're not collecting a whole lot of data points per acre with that kind of a system. It's less than half a data point per acre. But that's the data that we feed into the computer GIS software, which then takes that data and tries to interpolate the whole variable pattern through the field. And so when you provide that computer program with very few data points of information, it simply is a struggle to try and describe the true spatial patterns of variability in the field. So soil sampling is challenging in that perspective, that ideally we want to be sampling maybe at 1 acre increments or even half acre increments to get enough data to describe an accurate map. But now you're juggling dollars again, right? Because anybody thinks about a half acre soil sample and they start thinking dollars, oh my gosh, that's a lot of money. I would argue, admittedly without being able to prove economically, but I would argue that I think the value of an accurate baseline soil map, soil nutrient map, is maybe worth the extra dollars up front to accumulate a more intensive soil data set. Because when we use these programs and they draw these nice colored maps based on a limited amount of data, if those color maps are not accurate from a spatial perspective, then the agronomic decisions we make may not be accurate either. So somehow or other we have to simply collect more soil test data on a per acre basis than we do now to simply make more accurate spatial maps that we use to spread the fertilizer.
I'll ask you a very broad question. What's your opinion on using variable rate technology?
Variable rate technology certainly has its place if you have the data to support its use. And by that I mean, when a lot of us think about spatial data, we think about soil maps and that spatial variability. We may think about elevation changes in the field. We may, if we're running, say, a tool that estimates the electrical conductivity, we may have those kinds of maps. So we have a lot of different ways to come up with these different zones. And if we have the yield response data for those zones that tells us indeed there's a different optimum seeding rate, for example, well then certainly there's merit to variable rate seeding. But that is the challenge, is aggregating or assembling that much yield response data within these individual zones. And frankly, I would argue that not a lot of people have that kind of data. We've looked at this pretty hard in Indiana. We've had 90 population trials in recent years. We've had over 200 nitrogen trials around the state. And frankly, for us in Indiana, with the variability that we deal with, honestly, we do not see a consistent benefit to variable rate seeding or variable rate nitrogen. And it's the data telling us that. And that's really what's necessary for anyone, is if they have the data that says, yes, indeed, that responds differently, you bet, then variable rate is a tool. If not, it just, well, I guess if not, it's simply neutral.
The USDA would agree with that. The returns that they're seeing are something like 1% back. Okay. So it's very small, but certainly the technology seems like it's something that could have promise in the future, no?
Well, true, but it's sort of logical, right? And unfortunately, logic can be a systematic way of going wrong with confidence. So we always have to be careful when we think it sounds right, if we don't have the supporting agronomic data to back it up. And that's really what it's all about. And that's why people like me and others, my colleagues around the country, this is the kind of thing that we're doing, is trying to generate the data to support some of these newer technologies. And the precision ag technologies are probably similar to any other new technologies we have, that sometimes they come out without the knowledge or the data to justify whether or not they're needed. And so we sort of try to catch up, which we sort of always feel bad that we're in this process of catching up to the technologies. But until the technologies become commercialized, we simply don't have the opportunity to try and validate them, because almost everything we do, in Indiana at least, with me and a couple colleagues, is field scale on-farm research. So until the farmers have access to the technologies, it's a little hard for us to actually do the trials to generate the data to determine whether it's valuable or not.